Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Professor Michael Spitzer. Michael Spitzer is professor of music at the University of Liverpool. He was born in Nigeria of Hungarian parents, brought up in Israel, and emigrated to the UK during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. He was educated at Merton College, Oxford, and Southampton, and taught for 20 years at Durham University. An accomplished pianist, Spitzer is a world-leading authority on Beethoven, but he also writes widely on the philosophy and psychology of music. He lives just off Penny Lane with his wife and 2 daughters. Professor Spitzer, it's such an honor to have you on the show, and I just so love the subject that we're going to be discussing today.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. Thank you.
Well, living off Penny Lane, that has a lot of historical connotation with the Beatles.
It's difficult to avoid. I actually have my hair cut in the barbershop, which is mentioned in the song Penny Lane, and tourists habitually come in to take pictures of me having my hair cut there.
So you're famous in many different ways, then?
Well, my hair is, anyway.
Your hair is. Okay, I love it. So it seems like you, with all the traveling that you've had, living in so many different places, that you've gotten quite a flavor of culture and how people view not only music but life in so many different ways.
I have, albeit I'm an armchair traveler now. Scholars travel with their minds, and that is a controversial point, because anthropologists of music, and they're called ethnomusicologists, they like to hunker down in a particular culture or country for many decades, and they can speak to that with authority. So they're very suspicious of people like me who never go there, never get their feet dirty, as it were. But the calling my book has answered was to try to have a real overview, a planetary overview, and to travel across the whole planet. And it hasn't been done before.
Yeah, it was a really fascinating read, your book, The Musical Human. And what I really loved about it, I mean, obviously you have music as the theme through it, but it explores humanity, explores emotions, explores how communication is taking place. It explores like teenage rebellion. I love that aspect about Beethoven and the teenage rebellion that he was showing through music. I mean, it explores all these different aspects, and that's what it was so fascinating. Your book, it was really hard to put down, but once you started to get going.
Thank you.
I'm curious. So, what drove you to write this book? I mean, obviously, when you're a music scholar, you tend to just kind of focus on music or history of music, but you're going way beyond that in your book. I mean, so what drove you to have such a wide breadth of information to tie that into music?
See, music is entangled in so many disciplines. Music is an art form. It's also a science. It has acoustics. It has mathematical structure. It has a biology because it's embodied. Every culture in the world has music, and this reflects the fact that the phenomenon of music ties together every part of the mind, brain, and body. It's the most complex thing we have, which is surprising, therefore, that histories of music, histories of the world rather, never talk about music. A case in point is a very famous book called *Sapiens* by Yuval Harari. It was an international bestseller. And there's no mention of music there. It's understandable why, because there's no physical record of sound before Edison invents his phonograph in 1877. So you can't compare that with the pigment on cave walls or fossils. So that suggests it's impossible to do a deep dive, a deep history of music. And that was a huge challenge for me. How does one go about writing a prehistory of music? And what's also striking is that music comes 1 million years before *Sapiens*. So Harari begins his journey with *Sapiens* about 40,000 years ago. But I argue, and this is very provocative, that music comes at least 1 million years before *Sapiens*, if not many millions of years. And we know that simply because this is what birds sing and what whales do in the ocean. And I argue very strongly that birdsong is as much a music as human song is. And birds were around millions of years ago.
And so with that, because when we think of music, we think more of a human creation, but in reality, we look into nature, and that's where we find a lot of find kind of the birth of music, and by being able to replicate that type of communication and then move that in different directions, and that's kind of where music truly comes from.
Well, that used to be the scientific consensus until we improved phonograms, which are acoustic representations of what birds actually sing. And once we analyze birdsong, we appreciate the intricacy of how they, in a sense, improvise on templates and patterns in not dissimilar ways to a jazz musician does. Birds are creative, and their creativity exceeds what it needs to be to service adaptive purposes. So we know that birdsong serves the purposes of attracting a mate for sexual selection, deterring rivals, defining their home, and also their identity. So song does all of that, but there's now a new thinking that birds actually enjoy what they sing, and they take pleasure from their songs in much the same way as we have aesthetic pleasure in our music. And once you follow through that, then the border or the wall between animal song and human music just collapses.
Yeah, and you made a statement in your book at the musical human's original sin is turning away from animal music. I'd love to understand why that statement.
Well, I see that there are two main steps that we take along the very long journey from apes to sapiens. We evolved along the ape line through a whole series of stages of Homo ergaster, Homo heidelbergensis, the Neanderthals, and so on. So at some stage in that 8 million years, Australopithecines and Lucianardi 4 million years ago, at some stage, ape vocalization, this is the sound that apes make, changes into human vocalization and eventually into controlling the voice much more as our larynx descends and we control the hyoid bone. This is to articulate the sounds. At some point, we get enormous variety of sounds which exceeds function. So, for instance, the vervet monkey has 4 kinds of call, and each call serves to identify a particular predator, be it an eagle, a cheetah, a snake, and so on. Whereas somewhere along the line, the vocalizations of hominins, which are the missing links between apes and sapiens, they exceed function. There's too much variety. Variety explodes in what the voice can do. At that point, sound becomes aesthetic. You start to play with sounds for pleasure, and that becomes music. That's the first step. The second step, which is equally dramatic, is when you create tools to make music, which are the first bone flutes, which are 40,000 years old, were discovered in the South German caves. So this step transcends the human voice because you're making music with a tool. You're, in a sense, uprooting tones or notes from the voice where they more naturally belong, and you're creating them through technology. So there's two steps there. The first step is you're abstracting music from function, which is the way that animals use music, and the second step is when you're abstracting tones from the voice, and you're producing music with an instrument.
And you're talking about in your book, and one of the big components was when walking on two legs, having that, and that then changed the vocal cords, just that function in itself, and then also that evolved music in itself.
Yes. So 4.2 million years ago, when the first Australopithecine gets up on her two legs, and we call her Ardi. Was there music then? Well, no, there wasn't. But what there was rhythm, and there was the rhythm of walking. And what walking does, it starts to forge links between the brain and sound and physical or muscular exertion. And that serves to stamp the experience of music ever since then, because human music is all about walking and all about the metaphor of motion. We all seem to think that music moves, tones move. This is a metaphor, because if you look at the music, there's nothing to see. Tones don't really move, but we experience them as moving, and indeed in a left-right pattern, a meter. So this is very important, and the experience of walking also teaches hominins about time, how to expect something and how to remember something, and anticipation, and how to predict. A lot of music is based on predictions of what will happen next. So what we call music crystallizes several million years downstream from that. But it's a very gradual process. No one calls it music until, about 1,000 years ago in Western Europe. The elements of music were up and running, as it were, a long time before then. Things like rhythm and gesture and motion, all these are threads which are bundled together into the rope, which becomes music in due course.
This is fascinating. And so it's almost like you can't disconnect movement, music, and neural development. I mean, they all seem to evolve together.
Absolutely. And that was what makes it a human kind of music. So if you compare that with humpback whales, and in my book I argue that in many ways they're just as musical as we are. Of course, whales don't walk, and they don't have that link between sound and upright motion. But what they do have is three-dimensional orientation through water. And I actually hear this liquid effect when I listen to humpback whale song. You can hear the notes of a whale gradually flow from one to the other and melt and transform, just like water. And I think that reflects the fact that they swim through the medium of water, whereas we are on our legs, and birds conversely use song to navigate air. And I hear the sort of the erratic motion of the birds' muscles, the way birds twitch and flick a lot. I hear that in the way the notes of a bird's song twitch from one to the other. So I think music definitely represents, or rather reflects, embodiment, and every creature is embodied differently.
So like you mentioned, we're walking, we have legs, and because of that, and that will then imprint the type of music that we are learning, and that will also then obviously shift our neural development, because this is how we're walking, this is how we're moving, and then the music reflects that.
Not forgetting a sense of balance due to the vestibular system. It's the vestibular system which in our inner ear which controls our balance, which connects motion with sound.
That's fascinating.
In the human.
And then obviously with the whales, the humpback whales, their music, their sound, because they are using a different type of movement through a different medium, that will then shift how they express themselves, and then also that will then obviously change the neural development, in who they are and how they evolve.
Yes, and there was a theory. It's very hard to prove. It's very early days in whale science, but there was a theory that whales use music to map the ocean floor like sonar. It's controversial because it doesn't sound like the way that dolphins use sonar in very high-pitched squeaks, whereas whales have much deeper sounds. But still, it's a very interesting idea, and it fits the way that certain hunter-gatherer peoples in the world, such as the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, they use song lines to map the desert, and they peg songs and particular features of the desert or the landscape in a way, possibly, that whales use their sounds to map the ocean floor. It's an obvious use of sound if you think about it, so why shouldn't it be the case?
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a way then to tell a story, like ancient civilizations told stories and remember stories, and put them into songs. And by singing the song, we then kind of remember not only history, but now remembering landscape.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wonderful. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to HealthMade Radio. I'm here with Professor Michael Spitzer. He is the author of a must-read. It's absolutely fascinating, The Musical Human. We'll be right back. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Professor Michael Spitzer, and we are discussing music and how it relates to us as human beings, how we evolve, and also how we communicate with each other. So, talking about all these things, so what made it, what is the purpose then of music? What is kind of the full purpose? I mean, we talked about how to be able to navigate our environment. We talked about remembering historical events. I mean, what are all the purposes of music? It seems so extremely broad.
I think the trick is that only the West has this word, music. It's a single word, whereas most other cultures have many words to describe all the different things that music can do. It's a very complex thing. It's not just about pleasure. If you want pleasure, you eat what Steven Pinker calls auditory cheesecake. Right? What we get out of music exhausts mere satisfaction or sensation. And he does so many things. And the history of music is in many ways a list of all the things music can do. It's spiritual, it regulates our emotions, it captures memory, it defines our identity, which is why teenagers, it's a very important liminal stage of a human's development, the teenage years. They use music to construct who they are and who their friends, who their tribe is. If you go back in time, there's a theory that music evolved amongst apes because of what's called vocal grooming. So apes groom each other. It's a way of keeping the pack together. The problem with tactile grooming is that it's a one-to-one relationship. If you want to expand the group, then you touch people with your voice. And the metaphor of touching is quite moot. So there's a theory that music is a way of expanding sociality, expanding the social group. So the take-home message of my book is that music is fundamentally a social phenomenon. And even when you're listening to music alone in your armchair, music is full of conventional cliches. The melodies and the harmonies and the forms of the songs are always conventional and always social. So even when you're listening by yourself, you're plugging yourself into a social network.
That's amazing. So in regards to the apes, then, I mean, it was a way then. So would the group have a song, so to say, or sounds that would relate to that sound and would mark them as being part of that tribe versus another tribe, or do we see similar sound then between the different tribes?
Well, they don't, and one of the surprises I made is that apes are not musical at all compared to birds or cetaceans, and we know that because apes have no sense of rhythm, whereas insects like katydids or crickets entrain to a beat or keep time to a beat. And unlike birds, they don't have what's called vocal learning. They aren't able to create new sounds. So even when apes or monkeys have calls, these calls are innate. They don't change, and they don't vary across different environments. They're just not musical. What they do have is gesture. They're creative users of gesture. And my theory is that human music took a visual detour through the gestures of apes and absorbed the social functions of gesture into music. And this is why our music has gestures, invisible gestures, and why when we hear music, we visualize it. So we imagine that music goes up and down, or has shape, or has color, or has motion. And a biologist called Tokemzo Fitch even discovered that the corticoneurons in apes' fingers, which make gestures, evolved into the neurons in our larynx. So the gestures in their fingers really did become the flexing of our vocal larynx.
That's amazing. And so with that, talking about that evolutionary aspect, so in regards to, I mean, you're thinking of a human being. I mean, obviously there's impossible to be separate from music. I mean, music is everywhere, and like you're saying, gesture is part of music. But if you would deprive an individual of music in the best possible way, I mean, what kind of impact would that have on an individual in your view?
Well, a tiny, tiny fraction of humans suffer what's called musical anhedonia, which is amusia. It's an inability to gain any pleasure at all from sound. And we know that because there's a missing connection between the brain modules responsible for processing sound and those which give you pleasure. It can't be treated. It's simply innate. Looking at them, such people are perfectly functional. They can hold professional jobs. They can enjoy pleasure in other walks of life. It's not obvious where the deficit is. But that said, there isn't any culture in the world which doesn't have music. Music is always there, and by the same token, it always was there from our very origins billions of years ago. So it's hard to have a control group to look at any place, any corner of the planet which doesn't have music in general, notwithstanding those people who have anhedonia. So it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, because it's kind of like asking, what would a civilization be without oxygen? It's just something that exists. Yes. And yeah, absolutely. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to HealthMade Radio. I'm here with Professor Michael Spitzer. He is the author of The Musical Human, an amazing book. We'll be right back. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Professor Michael Spitzer. He is the author of The Musical Human. So I'm really curious. We're talking about civilization. We're talking about how music evolved, and also you made the mention that we really don't know. I mean, we have recording from music, over the last 100 years, but not really before that. So how did music change as civilization? So like you have the Roman Empire, and they had a certain identity to themselves. You had the Greek Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and they had a certain kind of type of civilization, and they you also have the Arabic. You have so how does music kind of reflect these civilizations, and how they behave as a civilization? Is there such a correlation?
Well, I'll get to that in a moment, but the place to start is with the baby, and the fact that babies are all born with quite similar propensities for music. And then gradually that becomes imprinted by their cultures. And that's when it starts to change and to reflect, in effect, civilization. So a nice example is variable carrying practices across the world. This is how we carry and how we rock a baby. So in West Africa, we associate West Africa with polyrhythms, or very complex rhythmic patterns. And there's a theory that you can correlate that with the incidence of polygamy, of marrying multiple wives in West Africa. Why is that? Because the way that you carry a baby, the way you rock it, gives that baby a preference for certain kinds of rhythms. If you bounce a baby in groups of 2 beats, 1, 2, 1, 2, that baby will prefer binary rhythm. If you bounce a baby in groups of 3 beats, it'll prefer a waltz in 3, 4. And it's similar with a baby's preference for consonants, is how consonant to harmony is. We in the West, we like major thirds or perfect triads, like in Three Blind Mice or Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, which is why we love Mozart so much in the West. But if you go outside the West to, say, Indonesia, to Bali, there children prefer out-of-tune octaves, which sounds hideous to us, horrible to us, but for them it just sounds spicy, whereas to them our music sounds terribly bland. So very quickly, after about year 4, year 5, musical nature becomes imprinted by musical culture. And from there flow civilizations. So what my book does, it takes us outside of our comfort zone in the West, or the path, you can say, that the West treads, and looks at China, it looks at India, it looks at Africa, and it's all rather different. Now, here's an example. In the West, we value notes or pitches, and our notational system is very good at capturing scales and harmonies, and we're much less concerned in how we play a note. We like to describe the note itself, C, D, E, F, G, and so on. Less concerned in how this note sounds, its acoustics or its timbre, its color. If you look at China, it's the other way around. China didn't traditionally evolve a system of music notation. And the story is said to begin 433 BC with the death of a Chinese warlord called the Marquis Yi of Feng. And when the Marquis's tomb was discovered in 1978, they found 67 incredible bells or gongs made out of bronze. And what that proved is that Chinese acoustic technology was 1,000 years ahead of the West. They were much more into the sounds and the acoustics of notes, much less into the notes themselves. And we hear that right the way through Chinese music. Take the example of the Chinese zither or qin. A zither is a kind of flat harp which you pluck, and the strings are very delicate. They're made of silk. Confucius is often pictured playing the zither or the qin under an apricot tree, and there's an association between the sound of the qin, the sounds of nature. So the sage would play out of doors where the music would blend with the sound of the wind and the grass. And it's the color and the sound, not the notes themselves, which is so important, which is why there are 40 different symbols for hand finger techniques to play the chin. And each position will create a different sound. Okay, that's China. If you cross now to India, the tradition there is much more about oral improvisation. So we in the West like to freeze or to capture a piece in music notation, and we thereby create a wall between the composer and the performer. So the performer is a mechanical instrument who simply, mechanically reproduces what the composer has created. You don't have that culture at all in India. It's a much more creative stream where you hand down a tradition from the guru to the disciple and then right the way down the chain. And each time a song or a kriti or a raga is performed, the artist is creatively reimagining the song, which was transmitted to them generations earlier. It's a living stream, and in the West we've cut that thread. It seems to be against nature what we've done in the West. It isn't the way most of the world transmits its music, and that disturbs me.
Yeah, I agree. Let's take a quick break because I mean this is such a fascinating topic, and I'll take a quick break. You're listening to HealthMade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Professor Michael Spitzer. He is the author of just an incredible book, The Musical Human. We'll be right back. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Professor Michael Spitzer, and we're discussing music and how that shapes civilization, how that shapes us, and how the kind of impact that it has on us and how important it is. So talking about all these different civilizations, and like you're saying, that here in the West, it almost seems like we have a disconnect then from disconnect from nature in a way. I mean, that music is becoming its own component, and it doesn't have the foundation like in the East. You're talking about the connection with the wind, with the trees, with and here it's a separation. We have the composer, and then you just have an extension of the composer, but you don't have that life flow almost, like in India where there's kind of a living organism that moves from from one individual to another.
Yeah.
So also in regards to then music, I mean, so we have some people that, let's say, talking about Western music, jazz, that individual listen to jazz, it's almost like it shapes their thinking and their behavior in a certain way, versus let's have somebody that listens to more classical, and that kind of shapes their neural development, their behavior. Is it something similar going back to these different civilizations? I mean, you're talking about how the children, how they were rocked. I mean, how the movement as they were being rocked, and that will then kind of give them a preference as to what kind of beat that they enjoy. But is it also kind of be that the kind of the thinking of individuals, or the thinking of that civilization, or the type of music that actually changed how that civilization behaved and interacted with other people around them?
Well, there's a darkness to Western civilization, and I don't need to rehearse here all the atrocities committed through colonialism and imperialism. A case in point is when Cortez lands in Mexico in 1519 and exterminates the Aztecs. And the first thing he does is to exterminate the Aztec musicians, their cheerleaders. And there is a link between globalization and the abstraction it takes to create musical scores. Because once you have music committed to paper, it's very easy to export it all around the world. It becomes like the English language, or like Shakespeare, or like sport, like cricket or football, or soccer or football. So it's difficult to disentangle the viral spread of Western music with colonialism and the Christian church and globalization, capitalism, neoliberalism, it's all part of our story. And it's become extremely, current with talk about decolonizing the curriculum, being aware of the complicity of Western classical music with slavery, for instance. And we're all going through a moment now, a stage of reflecting on history. To be perfectly blunt, is it acceptable to play Beethoven and Bach and Mozart and to ignore the rest of the world? There is a value system where we posit Germanic classical music at the center of global music, and that's no longer tenable. It's being interrogated and dismantled.
So it's almost then that if we would expose ourselves or expose our different nations to other cultures' type of music, that then we would, it's almost that would create then a neural change within our brain, I would think. I mean, because music has an impact on our brains develop, that maybe we would then be more tolerant and more acceptable. And
it does. Yes and no, partly because past the age of, as you know as a doctor, past the age of childhood, when our brains are no longer plastic enough to be rewired by our experiences. But on the other hand, music, unlike verbal language, transcends borders. We can get music instantly without knowing Japanese, not knowing African languages, and through music we have a communion into someone's theory of mind or state of mind or emotions. We have access to someone's soul through music. It's a magical portal, you could say. So let's not underestimate the power of music to bring humanity together. And this is why the European Union has Beethoven's Ode to Joy as its international anthem. And
so, going back a little bit, you made a fascinating point that there's only to a certain time in a child's life that they have the neuroplasticity, that where the music is impacting kind of how their brain is shaping. So can you go through a little bit the impact that that music would have, for a fetus, when the mother is carrying a baby? What kind of impact does music have on that time? And I've heard that things like Mozart, the baby is supposed to be more intelligent if the mother listens to Mozart while they're pregnant. I mean...
Yeah. It could be... I think people overstated the so-called Mozart effect. In practice, it's any music, any genre can have that effect, not just Mozart. But look, when the embryo is in the womb... in the amniotic fluid, its reality is sound, it's gurgling, and from week 11, the tympanic membrane already has auditory cells. It starts to hear from week 11, and by week 20, 100 decibels can startle the embryo, and then by week 36, ear and brain are fully connected, and at that stage, the baby can discriminate a recording of the mother from the real thing, from the real mother. So it very quickly starts to develop. And we know that once the baby is born, if you play the baby a recording of a heartbeat, it gains weight faster. And once it starts to relate to its caregiver or its mother, then something that Daniel Stern calls affect attunement kicks in. And this is the bond between the parent, usually the mother, or the caregiver has with the child, is based on essentially a kind of music, although it's not properly music yet. It's a duet between sounds and motion and contour and emotions. It's cross-modal. It's a very plastic. It's a very flexible. Call it a language, but which crosses between music and prosody and motion and emotion, and indeed smiling. It's the mutual gaze. Mother and infant are locked into gazing at each other, and it's a process by which the mother and child can share emotion as a very fundamental mode of social relationship. And they start playing games with each other. They coo, they smile, they imitate each other constantly. They surprise each other. And this is the origin of social relationships. And indeed, the social games of musical performance. So the way that jazz musicians interact with each other is not that different from the duets between a mother and child, really.
So it's all because I've listening to jazz. I mean, you have that the improvisation and the kind of like a little startling where you take it in a direction that maybe the other person didn't expect it, and then that makes your brain evolve, or it makes you excited because now I'm learning something new, and now I need to respond to that. And so it's very similar.
Yeah. It's play. It has all the unpredictability of play, of games.
So for mothers then that are curious as to what would be the best. I mean, obviously you were talking about movement, facial interaction, the smile, all these things, and contours. The baby is kind of recognizing contour of the mother, other contours, but. In music, I mean, what would be the best way, in your professional opinion, what would be the best way to kind of bring in music as you're pregnant and also as you're raising the child?
It would be to sing to the baby. So music isn't an abstract thing. The baby will associate music with the thing or the person which is most important to the baby, which is the caregiver. So immediately music or the tones will be saturated with meaning, with personal significance.
So over and above then just kind of playing music in the background, then really kind of using your voice and that way creating that, what you're calling that affect attunement, that becomes stronger with the voice. I think
the mistake would be to play the child, say, a CD of Mozart, because it'll sound irrelevant or distant or abstract to the child. The most relevant thing for that child is the mother or the caregiver. It doesn't matter whether the mother can sing or not sing. Everybody can sing up to a point. And the baby won't be that discriminating. It's as long as the caregiver is using their voice to communicate emotion through tone. And that's much more significant for the baby's developing musicality than playing them a piece of accomplished music on a CD.
And I mean, now we've been talking a little bit about communication, music in between individuals, and I've also read somewhere where actually there's a communication within the body where there's frequencies where cells communicate with each other through sound, and then also you have different bacteria that there's certain sound there. I mean, is there anything that you know in regards to that area?
Not a great deal. It's vibrational communication, which is technically older than sonic communication. Some animals like bees and indeed elephants communicate vibrationally through a substrate. A substrate is a solid ground like the earth or a beehive, or it could be a tree, and some kinds of beetles sing vibrationally through a tree, and that's a valid form of music. So bees have songs which are vibrational, and elephants can hear through their feet. They can hear thunder many kilometers away, and elephant song through the substrate of the earth communicates to the elephant tribe many kilometers distant. And some deaf musicians, there's a very famous British percussionist called Dame Evelyn Glennie, who hears vibrationally. So intercell vibrational communication is nearly 1 billion years old. We can't date it exactly, but it was there, right? And this pre-evolves the first rhythmic pulses in insects, which were about 165 million years old. So, strictly speaking, intercell music is part of the same package as sonic communication. As bodies, we vibrate. When we're listening to music, our body is also vibrating to it. And we don't talk so much about that.
Yeah, and what's interesting then is that then using the music or using vibration to be able then to impact, because you have a resonance, so each tissue or each cells. I mean, there are certain resonances that exist, and then you should be able then to use these tones, so to say, to either strengthen the vitality of tissue. I would assume.
Yeah, there's a scholar called Dr. Lee Bartle who used this to alleviate the symptoms of Alzheimer's and fibromyalgia. And his idea was that neurons in our brains make connections at 40 hertz or 40 cycles per second, which is like a low E natural on the piano. So by playing 40 hertz vibrations to patients, there's quite a dramatic effect on Alzheimer's sufferers. This is a very exciting new orientation, and it's yielding quite dramatic results, but very much work in progress.
It's amazing, and I know we're running a little short on time, but and also they found that different planets. I mean, in the cosmos, we have planets that gives off certain tones that relate to them as well.
Yes. Well, in 2003, the NASA Chandra Observatory heard arguably the longest, oldest note in the galaxy emanating from a black hole. It's a B flat, but it's 57 octaves below middle C. Now, the lowest note that the human ear can hear oscillates 20 times per second, but this B flat has a period of 10 million years, which is impossible for anybody to hear. That's a very concrete example of what's called the music of the spheres, this ancient philosophy that universal harmony controls the harmonic proportions of the orbits of planets and of stars, and human music or human harmony is just an echo of astral harmony. One of the most important ideas in the history of ideas in music. And even the Babylonian system, there had a system based on the number 60, and we get the idea of 60 seconds and 60 minutes from ancient Babylon. This is about 4,000 years ago. So they discovered that the same proportions of the perfect fifth in music, which is a 2-to-3 ratio, which means that if you have two strings, the upper string will vibrate at a ratio of 3-to-2, or 3 to 2 times faster than the lower string. Now, the same ratio also controls that between the length of the shortest day in the winter solstice to the longest night. And so the Babylonian mind, this was proof that the universe and the calendar were governed by musical principles.
That's just incredible. Well, Professor Spitzer, it's been such an honor to have you on the show, and I mean, your breadth of knowledge is just fascinating. And your book, said, I mean, once I start reading it, I mean, it's like you get sucked into a different world that you don't want to stop being in. It was really a really fascinating read. So I thank you so much for coming on to the show.
It's been my pleasure, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That is it for today. You're listening to HealthMade Radio. Remember, check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it.